All right, so the second topic is the one that's likely to win, and it's related to the first topic because missile defense systems are obviously designed to protect against missiles, and as I'll discuss, missile defense systems can actually encourage the development of missiles because other countries want to overwhelm missile defense. So what's actually included in this first lecture is kind of some general overview information about, is Korean missile proliferation and nuclearization desirable? How does the missile defense impact missile proliferation and nuclearization? And what are the pros and cons of missile defense beyond missile, and nuclear proliferation? Proliferation refers to the spread of weapons as well as to defense. So in this lecture, I'll cover the history of the Peninsula conflict, the history of the conflict on the Korean Peninsula, whether or not Korea is a modern threat, missile defense and ballistic missiles as threat and defense, and then other key items to know. So, as you may know, all right, there's a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula, is now divided by North and South Korea, which are two different countries. In North Korea, all right, you can see that the capital is Pyongyang, and then in South Korea, the capital is Seoul. You can see that neither of the countries are very big, and that's very important. We'll talk about a couple things to look at in this map. One is look how close Seoul is to North Korea. Most people live in Korea live in Seoul. Millions of people live in Seoul. So if North Korea can attack South Korea, they can, really kind of kill a lot of people. The second thing is look how close North Korea is to China. In the previous conflict, the Korean War in the 1950s, all right, which resulted in the division of the country between the two, China and Russia militarily supported North Korea. China's position currently is kind of a little bit, more ambiguous. They don't really directly support the current regime. They don't favor the Korean regime, but look how close they are. That's important to note that, in a conflict, it is possible that China could support North Korea again. And kind of more significantly, if the regime collapsed in North Korea, millions of refugees would flee North Korea, and they'd likely end up going to China. The map on the right, the top right, kind of gives you a little, better kind of an idea as to where the Korean Peninsula is kind of positioned in Asia. And then on the left side, that map on the bottom is a little bit of a kind of a geographic map. On the left there, you see the Yellow Sea, and then on the right, that's actually the East Japan Sea, and that's where North Korea has been shooting a lot of missiles into there. On the right, you could see Japan. Japan is currently allied. Japan is allied, has been since World War II, the end of World War II, with the United States and South Korea. So you kind of have Japan, South Korea, you have North Korea. They're both opposed to that, and you have a little bit of both of them allied with China. The history I kind of mentioned briefly, but just to clarify, and you may be, familiar with this, so I'll kind of move through it kind of quickly. Until the end of World War II, Korea was a single political entity, right? It was just one country. And then in 1948, after World War II, it split into two countries, the North and the South. And they went to war in the 50s. But they remained split together. Now, neither country has accepted the border between the North and South Korea. North and South Korea, as you may know, are still technically at war. And as I mentioned, North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, first backed by Russia and China. And there was a pretty massive war in Korea when that happened. The UN and the U.S. kind of fought off the North Korean attack on the South, but part of the way they won was through a very massive and extensive bombing campaign. Now, obviously, North Korea started this conflict, so maybe they deserve the bombing campaign, but obviously this killed a lot of people in North Korea, and it's kind of a site of, it's a kind of issue of remaining animosity today between the two countries. So what you actually have is an armistice agreement, not a peace agreement, because the war technically is not over. The countries are still at war, they just have an armistice agreement, and that armistice agreement is at the 38th parallel where the countries divide. So if you have two countries, sometimes that you have the North Korea, which is kind of technically called the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, and the DPRK. You also have the Republic of Korea, ROK. Now, the I just kind of put this next slide in because I actually had a chance to visit the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, which is the 38th parallel. That just refers to an area where there is kind of it's a small area, but where it's kind of like a buffer between the north and the south. And inside that, the picture of the building on the right where the soldier is standing, that's where the actual armistice agreement was signed. And that is literally right on the border between the two. So if you walk to kind of one of the other sides of that place, you actually are walking into North Korea, or you can stay on the south. And the bottom left, that's me, just kind of like the pictures being taken. That building immediately behind me on the other side of those blue houses is North Korea. And on the right there, you can kind of see the North Korean soldier. So it's a very kind of tense area. At the time, it was open to tourists. I don't know if there's still tourism allowed now because there's, obviously even more tension than when I visited. But that just shows you the area. This next slide is just two pictures, and I'll talk. It kind of shows you, like on the tour bus, right? It says mine. That's a landmine. There's a lot of landmines between the north and the south. It shows you how militarized it is. And this tunnel is significant because it's called the third tunnel. North Korea has dug a lot of tunnels underground under the border into South Korea. And it's generally considered that if a war breaks out, then the North will kind of quickly move into the south through these tunnels, and that there are other tunnels that have not been discovered yet. And talk about that a little bit more later. So the history, just to kind of quickly review, China and Russia supported the DPRK. They don't really support them as much now, but there is still some support, and the U.S. and its allies have supported South Korea. Technically, the two countries are still at war. And there is kind of a major difference between the countries. South Korea is relatively an economically developed country. It's an emerging economy. Seoul's a huge city. They have Samsung, other electronics, industries. And it's a democratic country. North Korea, despite being called the Democratic Republic of North Korea, is not a developed country. It's a totalitarian country. It's an underdeveloped country. There's a lot of poverty. One thing you could see when they visit, once you get up close to the North Korean border, that all the trees are cut down. The reason that's the case is because the trees are cut down because they use those for fuel. So now let's kind of look at that. Kind of provides some kind of overall context for the situation, for what's going on, what has developed. But let's look at the current history, especially that's relevant to the topic. So North Korea has a number of missiles. They first started developing what are called short-range missiles. They have a 500-kilometer range Scud-C. It goes 500 to 700 kilometers. That's important because technically, when we talk more about missile defense, a short-range missile is kind of something that a missile defense system that has capabilities against short-range missiles are looking at things that have ranges of 300 to 500 kilometers, and that means in the total distance they've traveled. They also have medium and intermediate range arsenal. North Korea has a 1,300-kilometer range missile known as the Nodong. Okay, and they've also developed 1,800-kilometer range missiles that have been flight tested. They also have anti-ship cruise missiles that they developed, and they have tested a solid fuel rocket motor and a sea-launched ballistic missile. It's also capable of traveling 500 kilometers. This one landed in Japan's air defense identification zone. And, they're kind of also threatening and suggest that they may have developed an intercontinental ballistic missile. A ballistic missile, it's important to emphasize, is one component of a nuclear weapon, right? So you have a warhead, which could be a nuclear weapon, a chemical weapon, or a biological weapon, or even really just other form of conventional warhead, but usually one of those three, attached to a missile. The missile goes up into the sky, hits a target, right, and comes back down. So just to kind of categorize those two different things. Now, that's kind of generally recent history, right, in the 2000s. But there's also kind of some immediate, I guess I would describe as immediately recent history. And this may, if I, let me just click through this. Can you see this even better on the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you have and I don't want to go through all these dates because you can obviously read, but I want to highlight a few things. All right. On January 1st, 2017, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un threatened immediate intercontinental ballistic missile threats to the United States. Right. So this is the first time, as they mentioned, they say they have developed an intercontinental ballistic missile system. China and Russia agreed to kind of support countermeasures against U.S. THAAD system. I have a second lecture that maybe we'll have time to get into today, but it's also kind of recorded here. It's kind of a little easier showing you the PowerPoints and talking through it directly this way because I did in front of a large group. But it's lecture 2, and you can listen to that. Okay, that says China and Russia have agreed to countermeasures to THAAD. THAAD is a theater high altitude area defense missile system that's designed to go after missiles that have a range of approximately 300 kilometers, right? So those first types of missiles that North Korea developed. So the U.S. wants to put a missile system, a missile defense system into Korea. And I'll talk about it more details later. But China and Russia are kind of generally opposed to this because they think it has capabilities against their own missile systems. So then we kind of see that, they've also launched an improved kind of intermediate range missiles, 300 to 500 kilometers. And they've kind of been parading these missiles, okay, moving them around. Now, the U.S. has kind of sent some parts of the missile defense system to South Korea. Some of it had started to get deployed, but another important thing to know, and we see this towards the bottom, is that South Korea, it was either March or April, impeached their president, all right, and they had a conservative president who supported the deployment of missile defense. Their new president, Moon, is not as supportive of missile defense deployments in South Korea. So this has kind of been slowed down. The most recent evidence you can find kind of goes both ways, and it's kind of really more predictive. All right, it's like, will Moon really support the full deployment of missile defense, or will he be opposed to it? He's getting a lot of pressure from China to oppose to not deploy this U.S. THAAD missile defense system because of its capabilities, but he's also getting a lot of pressure from Trump to deploy the missile defense system because of its capabilities, and the U.S. wants the THAAD missile defense system. And Moon, I think in the next couple of weeks or very shortly, relatively shortly, is going to visit the United States and visit with Trump, so I'm sure there'll be a lot more reports about that. But you can see this kind of escalation of the conflict. You may have noticed just on the news, even if you just casually have it on, or you see things on the news on the internet, that there's a lot of tension between the U.S. and North Korea now, primarily because North Korea has claimed it has developed this intercontinental ballistic missile, and saying it has the capabilities to hit the United States. The president has also just been shooting missiles into the East China Sea with a lot of regularity, increasing the threat. Kind of just generally been engaging in threatening rhetoric. It was also the case that when Obama left office, when he had his first meeting with Trump, he told Trump that he thought the greatest problem internationally that Trump would face, despite all the talk about ISIS, is North Korea. So there's a lot of kind of emerging consensus that North Korea is potentially a large problem. It's unclear how exactly anyone's going to deal with it without having a major war that would kill millions of people. But this topic is a hot topic. The topic generally of Korea's security is a very hot topic at the moment that's being discussed, every day, really, in the media. The THAAD deployment in particular is also a hot topic that's being discussed. So this is a very live issue. And all your arguments are going to change. If you debate this topic in the fall, you're going to have to make some adjustments to your articles. So this brings us to the question, though, why is North Korea doing this? Why are they developing these weapons, these missiles, right? They develop nuclear weapons. Why to put on top of the missiles? Why are they shooting into these China Sea? Well, they fear that the U.S. will blow them up. If you're aware of kind of recent history, you know that the U.S. launched an invasion of Iraq and toppled the government, right? Toppled the Libyan government. And, arguably we're kind of making some measures to attack the Syrian government as well. So Korea fears that if it doesn't have these weapons and is not capable of kind of implementing a lot of destruction, that the United States will attack them as well. Second, it's going to strengthen the credibility of the regime internally by developing these. North Korea doesn't have a lot going for it. It's really isolated because a lot of countries won't trade with them. There's a lot of sanctions. North Korea kind of blocks its ability for its citizens to communicate with the outside world because they don't want its citizens to realize how poor North Korea is. But this is kind of how the regime maintains its survival. They're like, hey, we're great. We're a military power. We can take on the rest of the world. We can confront them. They also people say, hey, they want a bargain for troop withdrawal. They want, the U.S. currently has 30,000 troops in South Korea. And they kind of think if they keep threatening the United States and threaten to launch nuclear attacks on the U.S., that the U.S. will just give up and move its troops out of South Korea, and that Korea will be unified under kind of the North Korean flag. They also want to undermine the USROK, the USROK, the Republic of Korea alliance, right? They want to weaken our alliance between the U.S. and South Korea, and really even other alliances in the region. And of course, they can make money selling weapons they develop, though. This is not really a significant source of funds because most countries don't trade with them. But it's kind of a bigger that they want to kind of protect their own government, both kind of to prevent it from being blown up and to strengthen the credibility of their own regime. Now, what can the U.S. and others do about it? Well, we've tried a lot of different things. Okay, we've tried sanctions. Sanctions are economic penalties. We make it more difficult for countries and companies to trade with North Korea. So they're pretty isolated, and the U.S. has recently put a lot of economic threaten China. We've encouraged China up to this point really to put more sanctions on Korea to threaten the North Korean government. And just yesterday, the United States sanctioned a Chinese bank and a couple individuals that were trading with North Korea, meaning that bank can no longer do business in the United States, and those individuals are limited to do that too. China is kind of very reluctant to put too much economic pressure on the North Korean government because they actually fear that if the government collapses, that millions of refugees will spread into China. You may have kind of be familiar with the refugee crisis, right, that Europe is facing. Millions of refugees have kind of made their way into Europe because their governments have collapsed in the Middle East and North Africa. And it's actually kind of, it's hard for those people to get to Europe. All they have to, they have to cross the Mediterranean Sea, or they have to walk these long land routes. Whereas think about it, if there's a huge problem in North Korea, and all these North Korean refugees start fleeing into China, it's just like the border's right there. There's no way you can completely control that border. So millions of North Koreans, in the event of a major conflict, would probably head into China. We've also tried to be nice to North Korea. We've kind of, tried what's called the Sunshine Policy. Well, South Korea's tried that. And their new president kind of backs a more soft-line policy, a more kind of sunshine policy. Let's try to be nice. One example of this is that there was a joint and kind of industrial zone between North Korea and South Korea that was happening, and they were kind of participating in it together. But after some of the missile tests, the South Korea kind of backed out of this cooperative industrial zone. And one of the things that Moon wants to do is kind of open the industrial zone back up. So then there's also kind of engagement approaches, which are similar to being nice, but also involve making it like a deal, a small deal. Like, for example, we had a deal in the early 1990s where we said to North Korea, hey, we're going to give you a bunch of food aid because all your people are starving, all right, as long as you don't develop nuclear weapons. Well, North Korea took the food aid for a long time, and then we found out they were still developing nuclear weapons. We can get China to pressure North Korea, but as I said, they're only going to pressure them so hard because they fear the collapse of the regime. China also has some economic interests in North Korea, though they're probably not vital to them, but they do have some, and that's kind of difficult. We could attack them, North Korea, but there's problems. Lots of people would die. Millions of people would die in a war. Or we could deploy missile defense. So that's kind of why this is it's really kind of the central kind of theme of the debate topic for the U.S. for the fall. And even in the Korea tournament, I know a few people from Taiwan might go to the tournament in Korea. We could, South Korea could just kind of advance its sunshine policy, its engagement policy. And I'll have another lecture where I kind of talk more details about that approach generally. But the sunshine policy or engagement policy would include probably things like, hey, not deploying missile defense, right, rather than deploying missile defense, which would be kind of more a part of a hard line or a containment policy. So that's kind of how missile defense fits into the general discussion. I am going to go kind of a little bit into missile defense now, just kind of not into so many details. But before I do that, does anyone have any questions or comments they want to make? No? Okay. So one of the central, one of the main debates in the missile defense literature, right now in the literature regarding North Korea, is should the U.S. Should Korea allow the United States, I think is the best way to say it, to deploy theater high altitude area defense into South Korea. And this is going to be a big part of our debates in the fall. There's different types of missile defense systems. Now, they're all designed, obviously, to stop missiles from hitting from hitting South Korea, or just generally whatever their intended target is. But they kind of function differently. The way that THAAD functions, as you can see on this chart, okay, is that the enemy launches a missile. It goes up through the boost phase, the mid-course phase, and the terminal phase. The terminal phase is where it starts to decline, and that's where the missile launcher, right, goes. Goes and the missile launcher on the right is really the thing that intercepts the system. Okay, intercepts the missile, and it's terminal phase. There are a few things important here to understand. The one is that theater high altitude area defense intercepts kind of missiles at high altitudes when they first start coming down. They don't intercept it at low altitudes. So other types of missile defenses are designed to do that, and other types of missiles that North Korea is developing, such as sea-launched ballistic missiles, cannot be intercepted with that. All right, that simply, the missiles are too high in the air. Second of all, you have to look at the range. It's kind of generally focused on intercepting missiles after they're in the air at about 300, which is a short-term, a short-range missile. It's a 300 kilometers to 500 kilometers. 500 kilometers is a medium-range missile. All right, it doesn't intercept things that are kind of launched at shorter ranges, and this will become important later because, as you know as you saw on the maps, okay, Seoul is only about 30 miles from North Korea. So if North Korea attacks Seoul, it's not going to be with missiles that have a range of 300 kilometers, right? Those are going to fly like way over Seoul. And since those missiles are designed to go higher in the air, you can't really just launch them, from southern North Korea, all right, into Seoul. North Korea would shoot these types of missiles that could be intercepted by THAAD. They'd be kind of more designed to attack kind of southern areas of South Korea. So a few things about that. One, there's a big debate about that, as I kind of just mentioned. It's very easy to do research on this. Second, the resolution doesn't specify, all right, itself whether it's a U.S. missile defense system. You don't have to just debate about that. You can debate about other types of missile defense systems. THAAD's the most controversial because the system also has capabilities against Chinese ballistic missiles and some against Russia's ballistic missiles as well. And that there are many kind of just different types of missile defense systems. There's civil defense, naval protection. There's regional and strategic. Also, the resolution just says in South Korea's best interest. It doesn't really kind of define what it means for those missiles to kind of be in South Korea's best interest, whether those interests are security-oriented, they want to defend themselves from North Korea or South Korea, or maybe China, whether their interests are economic, trade. One thing that's happened with the deployment of missile defense, one problem that's arisen is that these missiles that North Korea has China has reduced trade with South Korea, right? So maybe deploying a missile defense is in their best interest for security reasons. It's going to increase the security of the country, but it's going to undermine their economic interests because China is going to become more of a threat. There are also kind of political interests, like, maybe deploying a missile defense will improve relations with the United States because Trump really wants them to deploy the THAAD system. But if they deploy the THAAD system, it's going to undermine their political or foreign relations with China. So, the resolution does say in South Korea's best interest, and you kind of always need to go back to that question. But that's kind of what's going on. That's something to think about. Now, what are the benefits of missile defense generally? Well, it shoots down missiles, right? We all know that when we want the missiles to get shot down. We want to defend ourselves. It reassures our allies. So, for example, if like Japan's Article 9 of Japan's Constitution says that Japan can't develop nuclear weapons. That was part of the peace treaty that the U.S. negotiated, all right, with Japan at the end of World War II. Says that they cannot develop nuclear weapons. But Japan is kind of considering getting rid of Article 9 and starting to develop nuclear weapons. So if the U.S. is seen as kind of not supporting South Korea, if it's seen as kind of abandoning missile defense, then maybe Japan, in order to protect its own security, will develop their own nuclear weapons, and maybe that's good or bad, but most people think it would be bad. Depending on the president, as I mentioned, it could boost relations between the two countries, and of course, it supports South Korea's kind of own technology development, and of course, U.S. technology development as well. Now, what are some of the problems with it? Well, the biggest problem with just deploying missile defense is that it destroys what's called mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction is the idea that if one country launches an attack on another country. So, for example, if Russia launches an attack on China, then China would be able to retaliate with nuclear weapons, right? And that protects each country's security because they deter one another. Well, think of it this way: if one country has missile defense, like if the United States has missile defense, and the United States attacks China with nuclear weapons, right? China can't really effectively retaliate because why? Why wouldn't China be able to effectively retaliate? So think about it. The U.S. has a missile defense system designed to shoot down missiles. The U.S. launches an attack on China. Why can't China retaliate?
The missile defense.
Yeah, exactly, right? So you see how missile defense undermines the deterrence, right? Right. Oh, and I actually clicked through 2 more slides there. So it undermines the deterrence between these countries. That's why China fears that if the U.S. deploys this THAAD system, all right, that they'll have a more effective missile defense against Chinese missiles, undermining deterrence. It also hurts relationships with China, as I already mentioned, particularly THAAD. It's caused a lot of economic retaliation. So, for example, China has now prevented tour companies from booking tour groups to South Korea, all right, as a form of economic retaliation. Do you see this? Okay, so, and tourism is a major part of South Korea's economy. It also has kind of strained relations with the U.S., right? Now we even see yesterday the U.S. specifically sanctioning like 2 companies, but they kind of generally, this has also kind of undermined cooperations in other areas. It hurts South Korea. It hurts relations with South Korea. China-South Korea relations, as I mentioned. It caused political problems in South Korea. Not all members of the public support that deployment, so it's caused a lot of political opposition to the government, particularly in the South. And you could be looking at a situation where you're kind of actually going back to the Cold War. Do either of you know what the Cold War is? Or was,
Yeah.
I should say. What's the Cold War?
The Cold War was when U.S. and Russia kept on building up nuclear missiles.
Right.
And they don't want to attack each other because they will just bomb each other.
Right, but it was a kind of a period of really high hostilities, right? It lasted kind of mostly in the 70s and 80s, but kind of part of the 60s for a long period of time. So we could be kind of seeing the world kind of heading back towards those kind of old-fashioned alliances where you see Russia, China, North Korea blatantly kind of aligned with one another, and then you have the U.S., Japan, and like South Korea kind of blatantly aligned with one another, right? Cold War. Now, so that's kind of why missile defense is bad. Why is it bad for countries to nuclearize? Also referred to just proliferation. The word proliferation is just kind of a basic vocabulary word that means the spread of something, right? Like diseases can proliferate. And it's generally kind of in the context of this literature just kind of referred to as the spread of nuclear weapons. So why is nuclearization and proliferation, including others, chemical and biological proliferation, and then missile development bad? Well, there are a number of reasons. Countries have an incentive to engage in preventative warfare. Preventative warfare is you think, okay, this country is building up weapons. We need to launch a preventative attack. So if the U.S. attacked North Korea now, we may do so preventatively. We may say, hey, well, North Korea is going to get these weapons, and they're going to use them. So if we destroy the regime, if we topple the regime, then we'll prevent a security threat. This was part of the rationale for why the U.S. invaded Iraq, right? We wanted to destroy the regime to prevent a future war. Then it also creates incentives to preemptively strike. Now, preemptive strike is part of preventative warfare, but a preemptive strike can occur for reasons other than preemptive warfare. Preemptive strikes generally occur when one party thinks the other side is imminently about to strike, and they want to strike first in order to gain a military advantage. So those are related, but just so you know, they're not exactly the same thing. There are also kind of greater risks of accidents occurring, that when countries develop these weapons, I mean, they can accidentally be shot off, they could accidentally be dropped. There's also can be a miscalculation, where you might perceive another country is attacking or is about to attack, or that it's in your best interest to attack, and you can miscalculate as to kind of the desirability of warfare or the need for warfare. Of course, terrorists generally could steal these weapons, whether the warheads or the missiles themselves. They can also be sold. I mean, I said it's difficult for North Korea to sell these weapons, but they have sold some of them. Now, all right, why is nuclearization or proliferation of missile development good? Well, countries can defend themselves, right? They can defend themselves from the U.S. or just from other countries in general. It does establish mutual deterrence, maybe, if they have these weapons. They can develop the technologies, and I mentioned, especially in the case of North Korea, but really in true of every country, is that there's kind of an issue of national pride. All right, now, kind of towards the end here, I'll talk about kind of other important stuff to know, because this is, kind of an introductory talk. There are a few kind of key people and places, right? There's North Korea, the DPRK. Right, which is the capital is Pyongyang. Kim Jong-un is their supreme leader. Sometimes I forget and call him the president, but he's really not a president. He's not elected in any way. This is part of a dynasty. He's the third leader of the dynasty. He's just in his 30s, and he's the supreme leader of North Korea. He's worshipped kind of like a deity or a god. The second, and then you have Seoul, the Republic of Korea. The Republic of Korea, which is the country. Seoul is the capital. Jae-in-moon, all right, is the new president. You have THAAD, Theater High Altitude Area Defense System, PAC-3, South Korea Missile Defense System, NMD, National Missile Defense, WMD, Weapons of Mass Destruction. MAD is Mutually Assured Destruction, right, which we talked about. MAD, you deter each other. Then you have nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, chemical and biological weapons, CDW, CW, chemical weapons. You have ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, SLBM, Submarine Launched Ballistic Missile, MRBM, Medium Range Ballistic Missile. I highlight these because when you read through some of the articles, these are some of the things that you're likely to see, that you're likely to come across, and it's important that you kind of have an understanding of what these issues are. So that gives you kind of some overall background about the different issues kind of related to the topic. So now let's have a little bit of a, I think maybe now it's kind of, to kind of spend a little bit of a time like having kind of a little bit of discussion about, let me just flip over to the other section here real